Thank you very much. Nice to meet everybody here. Thank you for being here. Yeah, I'm Group Product Manager in the Google Core Machine Learning Group, which ends up focusing a lot on just how we build machine learning inside of Google. And yeah, I think, yeah, let's switch over now. That's fine. Today I wanted to talk a little about, I talk a lot about, I guess, decision making and product and strategy and things like that. What I wanted to talk about today is how do we think about doing strategy as individuals? Because we do this a lot as a group activity, right? We try to create strategy documents or slide decks or something like that that we call strategy. But a lot of the time I will get questions about kind of what are these, how do we end up resolving a lot of these challenges across the organization? And so a few of these challenges that I've seen when it comes to strategy, personally, things like building alignment, how do we communicate these types of things, right? How do we get it into the hands of people? How do we deal with all the stakeholders in politics that people end up like worrying about strategy? How do we have to overly perfect it and wordsmith it, things like that? How do we actually change behavior with the strategies that we end up creating? How do we actually create a strategy? Sometimes just not having a strategy is a strategy. There are way too many frameworks, right? And I'm going to talk about a few of them today, and this is going to be a way to think about how do we start to understand these frameworks, maybe in context. Strategies need to be flexible and adaptive, right? We live in a very uncertain world, and so everything that we write down as product managers, I've said this in other places, that basically everything we write is fiction. It's usually very boring fiction, unfortunately, but it is fiction nonetheless. And so how do we allow that fiction to be flexible and actually flex when the future and the environment changes around us? We could be wrong, right? Like things that we end up making bets on are bets. They're hypotheses. And I think that's something that we don't really like fathom enough, I think, when we see this very shiny strategy document or deck. And then finally, really learning to be strategic. And this is the thing I want to talk about today, right? How do we learn to be strategic? I recently, I do mentees, basically I have mentees within Google. I had 2 this last first half of the year. I've had mentees outside, but there's kind of this common question that comes up, which is how do I become, one, strategic, and then how to become more confident in strategy in general. And I think this is a little unfair because everything that we do is actually strategic, right? Every decision we make is related to strategy in some way. But I think a lot of people don't feel comfortable calling what they do as decision-making as strategic. And so that's why I want to kind of think about, like, how have I given advice to people? How have I improved my strategic practice over time so that all of you can be better at strategy? And so there's 3 things that I think are really important about strategy as an individual. And so one is practice. Right? We have to keep doing it over and over again. We have to keep on thinking about it over and over again for us to get better, and I'll talk about how to do that. 2, strategy is really about uncertainty, right? So how do we actually manage and wrangle the uncertainty, which I think is a core product manager kind of meta tenet, is to wrangle that uncertainty of the world. And then finally, strategy is really just about viewpoints. And so what are the different types of viewpoints that you should be understanding or thinking about as a product manager? So practice, doesn't make us perfect. I actually think that, the things that we do as product managers end up being in this kind of complex realm where there isn't even like good practice, right? A lot of the time we're building things from scratch. We're actually creating something that has never been done before. And so what that means is that we have to try things an awful lot to get better at the meta skills that will make us good at doing this over time. And so when I give recommendations to people about what we should start to do, things you should try out, and this is like a list of things that all of you can just take home and say, for your product, if you can do these basically 10 things, you will be better at strategy. And so this is usually a list of things that I'll give my mentees. And so the first one is 5 Forces by Porter, which is really more about like market context, right? And that's okay. I think that it's a little bit outdated today because it thinks more about the idea of competitive nature, when the reality is your biggest competitor is just like boredom and non-interest, right, for your products. The second thing is SWOT, and I hate SWOT. I think it is probably the worst strategic tool that exists, but it is one that everybody should do. They should try it out. They should see how horrible it is. They should see how biased you are when you fill these things out, right? We think about this, our strengths and weaknesses. We are absolutely lying to ourselves about those 2 sections. So anyways, you should still do it. It's on the list, but I hate it. The third thing is the strategy kernel, which comes from Richard Rummelt out of Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And this is basically where we take some type of challenge, which is either for our organization, our customer, something like that. There's a diagnosis, like what do we believe about the world, and then connect that to day-to-day actions. I think there's a really interesting kind of model there. And as a tenured product manager, of course, as you become senior enough, everybody has to create a canvas of some type. So I have created a strategy kernel canvas if you're interested. But I think it's a very effective one. Where to play and how to win is Roger Martin. And so he has a whole book about this, and he has a very interesting kind of like waterfallish type of graph about how you start to kind of ladder down and up inside of strategy. And so this is another one of those. Wardley mapping, which is something that less people have probably heard about. It's really about this idea of a value chain and evolution of technology. And it was created by someone named Simon Wardley, who's out of the UK. There's a lot of great resources, but I found this to be very interesting. And I'll talk a little bit later about like kind of how I've used maybe Wardley mapping when it comes to wargaming and strategic rehearsal. Flywheels, which is this idea of how are you building virtuous cycles within your businesses. Any type of model canvas, business model canvas, lean model canvas, you should do one of those. Doesn't matter which one probably, but you should try that. And then this last one is really even overstatements. And so even overstatements are this idea, you probably, if you've ever read the Agile Manifesto, you would have seen people overprocess. These are kind of getting at the core of how trade-offs within strategy really work. Because it's not about the idea of like, we're going to choose this really good thing and we're not going to do this bad thing, right? That should be very, very obvious. But strategy is about choosing between two good options and actually having a little bit of pain when you end up choosing one of those options. And so even overstatements are a really effective tool for that. So this is this like list of things that anytime I start mentoring someone, they go and do every one of these things. Sorry, it's 8, not 10. So you get a discount. But you do these things and you then start to understand a little bit more about all of the different ways that strategy starts to make sense when it comes to either being competitively focused, being, lying to yourself, understanding the challenge and the way that the things you believe. But these are all like really, really important aspects of how practice ends up working for strategy. And this has led to a project that I'm part of called the Uncertainty Project, which is a kind of a community. We have a bunch of different models and techniques and kind of posts about strategy. And what I wanted to maybe use this moment to talk about is what are the things that are really popular within the site, and I think may resonate with you when it comes to the way that, I guess, strategy in product management ends up working. So the top tools, the first one I mentioned earlier is this idea of decision rehearsals. And so decision rehearsals are where one of the things we don't do enough of to be able to understand the uncertainty of the world is actually practicing with our strategies to see how they might work. And so this is a concept where you end up taking a particular strategy, you build a Wardley map or some type of visualization of that, and then you take turns into the future where there are events that are constantly modifying the way you might react to this. And so this is something that is probably one of the most popular tools on the site that we have. But I think it's very important that that you try this out. And again, even overstatements, causal loop diagrams, which tend to be very related to the idea of flywheels. The OODA loop, which if people are not familiar with, is by John Boyd. And this is a observe, orient, decide, act. He was a Air Force pilot. He ended up really kind of establishing this idea of OODA loop when he was helping out the Marines. And so I think it's something that's like another tool to be able to understand this like loop of understanding, value engineering, and then decision rights. So all of these things here, the reason why these things are popular is because they're about this idea of how do we deal with uncertainty. Even things like decision rights are how do we allow for people to make the right types of decisions under uncertainty in some way. And then, just to talk a bit about the posts here, I think the things that are really most important to me here, right? So strategic ambiguity, the idea of Chronos and Kairos time, how do we understand narrative versus scheduled decision-making? All of these things end up being, again, about the uncertainty of the world, right? And it's not just because we're called the Uncertainty Project. There's lots of other stuff there too. But I think that is probably the biggest issue for a lot of people that are starting to build a practice around strategy, is this idea of how do you do strategic thinking under uncertainty. And so some of the strategic uncertainties that we want to worry about, right, is really this first one, which is the uncertainty of the world. And the uncertainty of the world, the way I would kind of establish this is that we always have imperfect information as product managers. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We actually don't even know what is actually happening now a lot of the time. And what I mean by that is that we don't have a perfect view into how our customers are always thinking, how they're feeling, what they want, what they don't want. We have metrics that are usually kind of following of that. We can sometimes get leading metrics from that standpoint. But one of the hardest things for us to just, I guess, get used to is the fact that we don't know much about the world. But I think the second part, which is maybe even harder, and what a lot of product managers have to deal with, is this concept of kind of uncertainty of agreement. And so because product managers, we don't really build anything, at least until we get like no-code tools and we can just like fire all of the engineers, which will probably never happen. Are there engineers in the room? All right, I'll be nice. But the uncertainty of agreement is that inside of every organization, and this is related to the idea of strategic ambiguity, is that even though we've set down something as a strategic direction, everybody has a slightly different way that they understand it. And the value of this is actually that we allow for variance of the way that people end up executing towards these goals, right? We can discover something new. It's like the idea of a strict hierarchy, right? Command and control ends up being only as like interesting or complex as the person at the top, because you're doing everything that that person says. But when you start to take something like commander's intent, which comes from the military as well, it's much more about like, where are we trying to go? And so strategy is interesting because you want enough certainty of the strategy that people are moving in the similar direction, but you want to allow for interpretation in the right ways to actually improve what could be possible in some way. And so, you know, one of the tools I've used to do this is I will actually take some type of, I'll call it like a proto strategy, right? The moment you start calling something a strategy, it has to be like wordsmith to death. But if you go into a meeting and you say, hey, we're just all here to do X, right? Whatever that is, it's like, we're gonna help this customer solve this problem in this way, right? And the good thing is that you can then start to weed out some of this uncertainty about agreement, at least from the standpoint of a higher level strategic sense. And so, yes, will mean alignment, right? And sometimes people won't say anything, which is maybe a bad thing. Like you want to try to get like verbal yeses or nos here. And then no will mean that there's, you know, some new information that you've realized that is maybe more important for you to now adjust. And so I think like that ends up being something that's really important to me, is this concept of how do we now start to internalize these different frameworks. And so one that I think is interesting that I want to talk about today is this concept of the product spine. And it's really this idea that within the world of like just decision making in general, we go from very low abstraction things, right, to very high abstraction things. We think about it either in the future or today or in the past. And the way that we start to build these things usually ends up looking like a strategy, a roadmap, and a task list, right? So when I say very low abstraction, I mean there's a piece of work, you know, and John Cutler would talk about it as like 1 to 3 days type of range of thing that needs to be taken care of. It's very specific. It's very low abstraction. It's something that can be done very easily. Above that are things like roadmaps, which you know, are more about the idea of ideally the problems that we're now solving, maybe the ones that we're going to go after next so we can prepare for those. And then the very high level ends up being the strategy itself. What a lot of people end up doing, though, is they actually think too far in the future. And so a lot of the times you don't have an actual roadmap, you have a plan. You have like, here's how we're going to execute these specific things all the way into the future. I think, unfortunately, a lot of people don't have like a real vision for their products, right? And I think a lot of the time when they're building out their roadmap or their plan, they end up doing it to such an extent that it's actually trying to take the place of a vision rather than actually doing something that's valuable for decision-making today. We also look to the past, right? So what were the principles that we started to use to make decisions in the past? Like, how well are we doing against our plan? And then the code itself is actually an artifact of a very low abstraction of what has happened so far. There's a lot of issues that come up, though, when we start to skew this spine one way or another within our product team. And this is related to something called the fallacies of strategic planning, which is it's an article that's in the HBR that I highly recommend that you read. But it talks about 3 fallacies that I think all of us will suffer from individually when we start to consider the idea of like strategy. So inside of this, we have this concept of formalization, where if we build the perfect plan, we build the perfect strategy, we will just win, right? We have this fallacy of detachment, where we're taking something that is, there's strategic thinking and there's tactical thinking, and you do one or the other, and they're never related in any way. There's strategy that's created by the ivory tower, and then there's the bazaar that actually creates everything. And those are separate, right? The third one is this fallacy of prediction, in the sense that we can actually tell what the future is. And so one of the things that this starts to make me think about is the idea of scientific management and the manufacturing of creative thought, which I think is bad, as you can probably tell with the font type. So how do we start to like avoid these fallacies, though, using something like the spine, right? How do we start to center ourselves when we're thinking about strategy into the now? So the first one is, when it comes to formalization, is it's less about getting it perfect, and it's more about this idea of ongoing alignment. It's less about this idea of the fact that strategy and tactics are not linked in some way. They are absolutely linked. And in fact, if you do not have these different things, these different levels connected in some way, you probably are doing something like you're either building the wrong thing, or the leadership team has the wrong understanding of what's being built. And then finally, I think this idea of prediction ends up getting us into trouble, because we start thinking about this concept of the far future, about where things will be, again, the fictions of product management, and we don't center on the fact that only decisions can be made today. So this is kind of a concept that I've used a lot of the time whenever I'm starting to think about, am I being strategic today, right? Am I making a decision right now that is actually linked to the strategies that are valuable to the organization? And that type of like internalization, I think, it's been very powerful. The next thing is really a new concept for me, which is this concept of I'm calling it 360-degree strategies. But 360-degree strategies starts to think about, again, I'm an ex-consultant, so it's all about 2x2s. So you gotta have like a good 2x2 in your pocket whenever you're walking into a client meeting of some type. I still think, again, there's this kind of tension between how do we make decisions in the now versus the far future and the past. And I think the difference between, say, like the product spine as a way to center abstractions in the now, this is more about what are we doing and what are we not doing. And that is another thing that I think, as we start to learn to practice strategy more, we do a better and better job of saying what we're not doing. Let me talk about that in a second. So the first thing that we usually do, so when someone becomes like the person in charge of strategy, the first thing they usually do is actually collect everything that you're currently doing and put it into a document and say, here's the strategy. So the list of things, right? The plan of what we're actually working on today. And these are things that are ideally working, right? There should be metrics around them. There's things that we've discovered already. It's in the marketplace, it's making money, ideally, or it's exchanging value. But those working strategies are things that we're doing, but mostly focused on the fact that it's from the past rather than the future. And then once you start to build out this current plan, or like what we're actually building today, you start to think about the future and where do we want to go? And these are more like aspirational strategies, is what I'd like to call them. Aspirational strategies end up being, we believe that we want to go after this customer segment, we want to solve this new problem, we want to build this new thing, or we feel like these types of decisions that we need to make in the future, but we haven't made them so far today, are very, very important. And so these end up being kind of the aspirational strategies. I think there's some interesting, I don't know if people are familiar with the term code smell. The code smell is this idea of that inside the code, you can look at certain patterns and you can see that there's going to be a problem before it actually happens. And the reason why is because there's a lot of the time where we start to be pattern machines as product managers, where the complexity of the world is less about the idea of this exact case we understand specifically, and more about there's a pattern that we're now matching against based on our past experience. And this is actually very much related to like naturalistic decision making, tacit knowledge, and the reason why product managers are frankly not that effective when they first get started. It's because of that intuition. And so one of the things that I've started to intuit around these differences between these aspirational strategies and working strategies ends up being that if you have lots of working strategies but no metrics for them, that probably means that you don't understand what's going on. If you are only pure aspirational strategies or future bets, you haven't actually shipped anything. And so I think there's like balances that we start to think about when it comes to this what are we doing aspect. The other aspect that I think is interesting is what are we not doing? And so when it comes to the past, right, there are plenty of things that we failed at as product managers. We tried to ship and didn't work, or we put it into the marketplace and no one cared. And so in those particular cases, I call them kind of abandoned strategies, things that are warning stories. They're inside of the organization culturally that usually, one of the best, I guess, definitions of culture that I've heard was that culture is really what is understood to be rewarded here. And so inside of those cases, right, what are the cases where we were not rewarded? And this can create some bad effects as well. But these abandoned strategies end up being helping people understand what they should not be going after. And then finally, the last piece is this idea of like bizarro strategies. So if people are familiar with like Bizarro Superman or like the Seinfeld, like the other group of Seinfeld that were like the mirror images of them, these are alternatives, right? And so these are things that if you were to make a choice, right, there's two good things that you can choose from. What's the other thing you didn't choose? It would be something that your competitors should choose, probably, because it's another valid way to do things. And I would argue that for anything that is up in the aspirational strategies area, if there's not a corresponding Bizarro strategy, it's probably not a real strategy. And the reason why is that this comes back to like Richard Rummel when he starts talking about the idea of like fluff in strategies, right? So the concept of like best in class. If you have that in your strategy, it probably doesn't mean anything. Because what would be the alternative? Would you make a hard choice to be worst in class or something like that? Well, I always I can always come up with examples of maybe where I'm disproving my own rule here, but it's like the idea of, say, Singapore Air, right? Being very much about luxury, about high-end flying, things like that. And then we have like Spirit Air and Ryanair, which seem to be actively hostile to their customers. But I mean, it may be a more realistic version is like Southwest, right? Which Southwest doesn't go after these huge routes. They go after very kind of commuter types of things. It's very low frills. There's not a lot of like, pageantry when you enter the plane, things like that. And so that idea of kind of bizarro strategies end up being like a very powerful way for us to start to understand like what matters within our world, within our strategies. And so this is what I would call kind of the 360-degree view of a strategy. And so, if we start to then put these things together, right, is that we're going to choose these things over that. Competitors do this. This is the that. We're going to continue to choose this over that, right? We're going to continue to do these things over time. We're going to continue to monitor them. And we're not going to do these things anymore. And there should be movement of these things, right? There should be new things that are coming in on this side that are moving this direction or moving this direction. That to me is, I think, once I've started to think about this, and I think of it as like a network almost, right? Like these all things are related to the way that we end up building our strategy. And so I think from a strategic thinking standpoint as an individual, if you can't piece together, right, the world of your product, and I was talking to someone about this last night, but every single document that exists within a product manager's like Drive or SharePoint or whatever ends up being a piece of fiction that builds towards a larger world. And so that larger world is like, if we think about like Lord of the Rings or something that spent a lot of time on world building, there's a lot of background that's there. And all of these things end up being like interrelated. And so inside of your documents, I think what ends up, and I always think about documents because artifacts are things that we end up thinking about as product managers. If you end up having documents that are solo and they stand alone a lot of the time, you don't build this type of network. You don't build these types of associations between the different parts of kind of your world. As an individual, I think that's a very powerful concept, right? If you write a document and you keep on repeating the principles, the personas, any of the strategies that you end up doing, you're probably relitigating them every single time. Rather than creating, and again, John Cutler would call this a lattice work of kind of documents, right? So even the idea of low abstraction things like 1 to 3 days, 1 to 3 weeks, 1 to 3 months, 1 to 3 years, right? I dislike timeframes because I think that it ends up getting us into weird thinking about like, what does 10 years even mean in the future? It's very hard. I mean, the team I work on, we do actually like build chips. And so yes, 2 to 3 generations in the future could be 10 years, but it's very rare that people end up working on those types of things. So this lattice work, I think, is something that I've started to practice internally, is that if I'm not finding linking between all of the different things that I'm building in that moment, I'm probably not actually interrelating it into the strategies that end up making sense across the entire group. So I think that's something I've really started to think about. And so, I think after every single time I've put people through the gauntlet of those 8 different strategic kind of concepts, including SWOT, people end up building more confidence inside of their strategic thinking. And that confidence actually ends up paying off a lot for product managers, right? I think one of the hardest things that I've had to deal with, and I think a lot of product managers deal with this, is this idea that we have to be very confident or confident seeming, but also at the same time embrace the fact that we don't know very much. And so I think that's okay, right? The thing that we should be building are these confidence and the meta skills around strategy, right? Those meta skills of how do we understand, internalize, how do we connect as a network, how do we ground ourselves in the now of today to be able to actually create strategy, ends up building that confidence in the meta skill about how we might answer these questions, how we might work with people in some way. And so, I'd like to remind everybody here that, 1, strategy is practice. 2, it's very much about uncertainty. It's about the uncertainty in the way that you actually understand the world. And that there's all these different viewpoints that as you start to build your ability to do strategy, you can pull these viewpoints to be able to understand it in a different way. So again, going back to the idea of, say, a Wardley map as a value chain, that helps you understand where are there like components that we should be evolving over time? How should we commodify the things that we have? Versus flywheels are more about this idea of how are we building virtuous cycles for our customers? And those are 2 very different viewpoints when it comes to the way that you would think strategically about the world. And so, I ended a little bit early, but I did want to like spend time for questions here. And what I would love to hear from everybody here as well is like, what are strategic thinking or principles or frameworks that you've used? And I'm happy to also talk about kind of more about the way that we end up doing strategy here. But thank you everybody for listening to me, and thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Sarah Hines. I'm VP of Product at Dotdash Meredith, a large digital publisher. And, you really got me with the best in class, because that is very much in our enterprise strategy. And so how do you, what strategies have you developed to help executive teams understand how to do better strategy, understanding bizarro strategies, understanding the complexity of how this is all done?
I guess like the thing that we can do, again, taking this theme of internalization, is that a lot of the time we can't depend on our management to actually be good strategic thinkers, unfortunately, right? Like, even though that's why, the reason why they're there usually is because they're managers rather than strategists. But they're assumed to be strategists because they're managers. And I think that's maybe one of the things we just need to get over, right? Is that they might be good at like doing all the mechanism of management. They might be able to be the confident leader that's up there, like, let's go do this. But strategy is a skill that takes a lot of practice to actually build. And so what I've usually recommended is that if you get into an organization and there's not like this strategy that is say the 360 view of the strategy, it's not making hard choices, it's not saying no to things, it doesn't have a bizarro kind of like alternative strategy that would make sense. It's up to you to actually not only do it yourself, but I think to do the job of your manager then. And unfortunately, that's like the best advice I can give you. I don't think that's bad though, right? Because I think if anything, what it starts to show, like inside of these organizations, people want to be seen as strategic, right? I think what I would argue is that the concept I brought up about proto strategy, or where like we just say, hey, what do you think? We're all here to do X, right? It doesn't have to be official, right? And even when talking with your manager, this is something, again, I've used that technique an awful lot with managers that have not had strategic kind of backgrounds or even like a good strategic plan is I've like gone to the meeting and said, so, you know, here's how I'm thinking about, like, we're here to solve this problem for this customer in this way, right? And we believe we'll do it, like, and we'll achieve X, right? And if they kind of go just like, yeah, that makes sense to me, right? You learn a little bit more about the way they think about it. Now, the problem is that when you don't write things down, right? When you don't have it set somewhere, it means that everybody has a slightly different strategy in every person's head. And that can be a strategy, right? Like also like even within larger corporations, there will be a lot of time where you'll have multiple teams that all are doing the same thing, right? And so anyways, all I'm saying is that each one of those teams could have a slightly different strategy too. So yeah, anyways, that would be my recommendation is that you do their job, unfortunately. And we should not assume that managers are going to actually be good strategic thinkers. So yeah. I think there's someone back there.
Ideas that are incoherent or
Yeah.
rely on an incoherent mind.
Yeah, incoherent ideas being, yeah, the Derek Sivers has a really great post that's called 2 cents, which is, I think, a real hazard for us as people within management chains where a manager may be in a group discussion. It's like, what would happen if we did this, right? And unfortunately, they just meant it as a throwaway comment, right? Everybody inside that meeting, though, is like, oh, we got to now add this to the roadmap. And so I think, again, when we start to actually build out something like a 360 strategy, again, we can call it whatever you want. It's basically that we're going to do this over that, right? And we agree that we're going to do this over that. Repeating that back and saying, how does that fit here, right? Like one of the things that, I also do a lot of stuff around product operations and the way that we like set up product management teams to be more effective. So PMing the PM experience is what I like to call it. Like there are an awful lot of times where a manager will come to me and say, I want something. I want you to like enable this thing. And usually one of the things they'll ask is like, I want a status report cadence for my team. And kind of like SWAT, it doesn't really help you at all, in my opinion. I think there's a time and a place for status, right? I think there is. But I think that a lot of the time when they ask for this, it's actually they don't know what they're asking for, right? What they're asking for is they're probably asking for they need to know when escalations are going to happen, right? They want to get ahead of those things. They want to be able to, like, when someone asks them about something, they want to be able to have like, oh yeah, I know about that, right? They want to just get a pulse of the business. They want to understand the operating kind of style of the organization. And then the last thing that they want is they want like the safety blanket, right? Which a lot of dashboards are also the same thing, right? Like I think if I see dashboards on a feature list somewhere, I'm like, that doesn't mean anything. Because it's more about decision like assistance than it is something like creating a dashboard that's pretty that I can like self-serve. That doesn't mean anything. So that's what I'd say is like, I think a lot of the time it's asking why in a way that does not get you in trouble with your manager. And so I think that's one thing that I end up doing, right? So like if someone asks me for a status report, I say like, well, what's the thing that you're trying to get at right now, right? Like what happened that you're now trying to like worry about going forward? And this gets back to kind of like, I think there are really 4 ways that you can do any job as a product manager. One, you can do the best job you can, right? You get something, if someone asks you to do something, you do the best job you can, you put you do your A work, right? There's 2, which is you get this assignment, you know it's not worthwhile, and you basically just make sure it happens, right? The third one, which I do an awful lot, is that you get a request, but then you subvert that request in some way, and you actually turn it into the request that they really mean, right? Rather than something else. And then the fourth one is you can just walk away and quit. That's the fourth one. But I do think that's what we need to do more when we talk about strategic discussions, right? Is that there is like a surface thing that we're being asked to do, but the reality behind it is probably something very different. And that's why we do user research, right? That's why we look at data. That's why we do all these things, because the real request, like, it's another kind of like thing that I end up bristling at is if there's ever, like, yes, user stories are supposed to be spoken by a user, but if user feedback ever makes it into a backlog, that is a failure. And the reason why is that we should not be building something for one customer, right? We can use this as anecdotes, we can use it as data, as like qualitative information, but we should be the filter, right? We should be the filter as product managers to turn something that is highly specific into something that is more generalizable that allows us to increase our possible addressable market. Yeah.
So I'm going to call myself out. I clapped when you said SWOT sucks because it sucks. But we kind of touched on metrics quite often, but we haven't really delved deep into them.
Yeah.
You did mention the safety blanket, and I really appreciate that. But then in the age of fast data,
Yeah.
good sentiment analysis, and everything else like that.
Well, we should talk about sentiment analysis
Yes.
because I mean, again, in the machine learning world, there's very little correlation to how people are feeling and what they say, is what I would argue.
Hallelujah.
So,
And
yeah.
I really appreciate it, but that's kind of the thing. Do you feel like yesteryear's metrics that we actually use in a lot of organizations do match with the insights that we're able to generate these days with data? And how does that mismatch? And I'm already leading with that question. So really appreciate it. Is actually
Yeah, let's use some
causing
clean
us-
language. You're already kind of taking me in a direction, I feel, but
Yes, thank you. I usually do
Yeah.
that. But how does that mismatch then affect
Yeah.
how these organizations are actually approaching strategy?
well, this is the problem, right? Is I work with a particular team that is very data oriented. Like they have lots of great data. When they need to make a decision and they don't have this like one very specific piece of data that they should have to make that decision, they stop making decisions, right? And so I think there's this inverse that we need to be doing, right? There's a great book, How to Measure Anything, right? Which talks a lot about this idea of that if you have 100% certainty, you've probably made a decision too late. And the reason why is because the arbitrage of like, value of early decision-making with less data ends up being incredibly powerful when it comes to creating better market positions, creating better products, surprising customers, delighting them. Those are things that require, it's not inductive or deductive thinking, it's abductive thinking, which is this idea that I will take evidence that I have available to me, right? I will use it to internalize a model about maybe the customer, about the world. And that's what product people are, is I kind of see us as like the Fahrenheit 451 book people about the customer, right, is what we're supposed to be, I think. And what we do is we have to make a decision with less information than we would usually feel comfortable with. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to make these huge decisions, right? Like Amazon people would talk a lot about this idea of like one-way versus two-way doors. Unfortunately for them, the arrow of time continues to move forward, so there's no such thing as a two-way door, first of all. But second of all, what I would say is that if we can actually start to make decisions that are smaller, right, that are more about learning, right? That's the other thing that I don't see a lot inside of these things where we're making a really big decision, is we don't talk about like, how are we going to learn after this, right? Even the idea of shipping a product is a decision point that we should be learning from. And so usually we'll say things like success metrics inside of there. But I think beyond that, it's like, what are some of the more signs that we should be looking for? Like what comes next after this that we now need to also do? So I think this is the problem, is that yes, metrics are very powerful. They tell us about the like kind of the what is going on, behavioral aspects of things. It doesn't tell us how people are actually thinking or feeling about our product. That's qualitative research, in my opinion. But even that, you have to go after the fact that you're not going to be able to interview every single one of your customers. So there's a balance here. And I think that is, I got this far without saying it depends. Wow, it's pretty amazing. But like, the fact is that it's about this balance between making a decision where you have enough to be able to make a bet and to understand how you might learn from that, but not to the point that it is perfect information at that. Like, I think that's the balance that you need to find within these things. And that's why like data-driven teams to me, like, yeah, we're all data-driven. We all do that. You wanted to have a follow-up question? Did I not tell you the answer you wanted? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's fair. And I guess your point about this is like, a lot of the time strategies will sound like we need to make 20% more revenue, right? That's not a strategy, right? That's a metric. It's actually a following metric. It's not even a leading metric, right? And so from that standpoint, I do think that metrics are valuable, but I think it's different than the metrics that we usually think about. And there was a great tweet that I've never been able to find again, but it was basically where if you are trying to do something differentiated, you should measure things that no one else is able to measure, right? And so I think an example of this would be like Zappos thinking about the way that they do customer support, right? Again, the classic story is that rather than decreasing the amount of time that these customer support agents were on a call, they just said, whatever you have to do to get CSAT, right? And a very particular type of CSAT. It wasn't basic CSAT, right? So I think that idea of like learning to measure something that your competitors cannot measure, I think this actually trips people up a lot with OKRs, right? So when trying to apply OKRs somewhere, the KRs, a lot of the time, if it's a really good objective, the KRs have to be baselined at first because you have no idea what they are, right? The actual measurement for that objective ends up being really hard to do. And so I think the thing is that you can use techniques that end up kind of backing into more strategic thinking and metrics. And so, John Cutler, a friend of mine, like I think he does a lot of really great work around this. He used to be at Amplitude, he's now at Toast, but he has a whole playbook about North Star, right? And there's actually startups like Double Loop, where what they do is trying to take this like concept of objectives and then backing into kind of like more leading like metrics. You can do workshops where if you do like you do get like you get handed down to you 20% more revenue, right? How might we do that? It's the first question you should ask. And then from there, you start to back into those leading metrics. And so I don't think it's like, I think that's the problem is that a lot of time with product managers, I think we want to try to please our management in some way. We want them to actually believe that we're doing the right job. And for us to do the right job, it's actually to do the work that they probably didn't do. And so that's what I would add to that point. Yeah.
We've got about 4 minutes.
Oh, okay, great. We have one question here.
What you talked about with the strategy versus the bizarro alternatives resonated.
Yeah.
And sort of, I'm thinking, hey, that's a test. Is this really strategy or not?
Perfect.
If it's not strategy and it doesn't pass that test, how do you think about those things, prioritize those things? Where do you record them if not your strategy document? Like, how do you make sure, hey, we need to make sure the client is satisfied, good service? Where does that belong?
Well, yeah, and usually, like, those are suitcase terms for other things usually. Because when we talk about, like, customer satisfaction, like, we want to increase CSAT, right? Like, what does that mean? And the real thing is probably, like, we want the person to have actually succeeded in their task, right? We want them to tell, like, again, we don't want to do NPS, and we can do a bunch of NPS bashing right now if we want to. But the things that I think you should do, right? Even at the level of just like, say, a specific feature, if you have a goals section, you should definitely have a non-goals section. If you have a primary customer, you should have a non-customer. If you have a set of features, or like inside of Google, we talk about critical user journeys, CUJs, you have job to be done, whatever it ends up being, you should have a huge list of all the other things that you're not going to do. And I think that starts to build this thinking that we're talking about, which is bizarro. Bizarro, like alternative world type of stuff, is that you should be actually documenting it almost at every level as possible. And so in the strategic documents that I like to write, they include a lot of even overstatements. And the reason, not a lot, but I mean, I think you get into the range of like 3 to 7, that ends up being pretty powerful. I think it's hard for people to keep all those things in their head. And then the other thing is, like, as a consultant, I also just want to say that it's not a MECE type of thing, if people are familiar with that. Like, there will be conflict, and there will be conflict between these even overstatements. But that's what a strategy is supposed to be. It's supposed to be complex, right? It's supposed to be the fact that we write down these rules about this over that across a bunch of different ways, or we're going to do all these things and not all these things. And then when the case comes up, we're like, well, we really think we should do this. This seems very valuable to our customer. It's in violation of our strategy. That's a good thing, right? Like, you should then adapt your strategy. And so I think that's the problem, is we don't put enough of this stuff as a line in the sand, right? And honestly, I don't think it behooves senior managers, unfortunately, to do that, right? Like, if you make a hard decision and you're wrong, because, and again, like, we should not be rewarding outcomes of decisions. We should be rewarding good decision making. And so if you start to do that, I think that's where maybe senior managers are less likely to make like really hard decisions that they should be making. And that should be their job, ideally, right? But they have so little context, right? You're bringing something in front of someone for 5 minutes in like an agenda of 20 items. You're not going to get like the ideal thinking. And I hate the fact that I keep on referencing John Cutler. Maybe he should have been here instead. But John Cutler wrote a really good post just about like this like issue around simplicity. So like when someone tells you to come back with like a 3-bullet version of this, it's like, well, yeah, I can give you this, but it's not going to help you, right? This is why I bristle against like status reports, is that like, if you want to know the status, just come to my meeting. Like, you want to see what's going on inside this project, come to the meeting and you can actually see it. If I just give you a 3-bullet report, or I give you like a red, yellow, green, which of course is now a game, right? Because like, I'm going to put green up until the point I can't put green anymore and it has to be yellow. And then I'm not going to put red as much as I can. And so if you have real rules around this and you have like safer cultures, you have things like that, then these types of things work better. But honestly, I mean, just maybe getting back to your point, right? We should be making harder decisions. And as product managers, I think we should be okay with like making a decision and saying, we're making this decision to not do this because of X, Y, and Z. We should still explain. We should talk about alternatives that we considered. And we should communicate that. And there's a whole, I have like a whole nother talk and writing like a playbook about decision-making and everything that I didn't go into here, but I think like having that discussion in a way that's helpful, and then having a decision point, and then figuring out the communication, and then learning from that decision process, I think ends up being much more powerful for people. And that allows you to then have these like things that we considered but we didn't do. And that's at, again, every layer of abstraction, I would argue. So yeah, do we have? Oh.
Yeah, we're at time.
Oh, we're at time, all right. Well, thank you everybody so much for your time today. And I'd love to hear how you try these things out if you do. So thank you.